I'm pleased now to welcome to the stage Congressman Henry Cuellar. Congressman Cuellar has called for bipartisan solutions to many of the country's most pressing issues, including immigration and budget reform. And he recently introduced bipartisan legislation to create a commission to assess mass shootings. Welcome, Congressman, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure being here with the Hill, and it's a pleasure being here at the American University. I got somebody from the San Antonio area, Danielle Villalobos, so there you are. So it's good having somebody from San Antonio.
You got a plant in the audience, right? That's
yeah, that's right. So.
Okay, so you are not the normal Democrat. You endorsed George W. Bush in 2000. You beat an incumbent, which is never in a primary, which is never.
I think I had less than a 0.1% chance at that time.
Exactly. So, and of course, all the incumbents favor the incumbents. So, and so also you're on with the House Democratic Caucus. You're more conservative than the average, certainly. And so that has that over the years presented some awkwardness in the party because you are not a down-the-line Democrat.
No, it hasn't. I mean, first of all, I'm part of Nancy Pelosi's leadership.
Yep, you are.
I'm the Democrat that pays his dues. As you know, Democrats and Republicans have to pay dues to their parties. And for the last 3 election cycle, I'm the first Democrat to provide the dues. So, you know, when somebody complains about my voting record, I'll tell them, pay your dues, then you can talk to me about it at a later time, you know, because some of the folks are very active in the Democratic caucus are not very good at paying their dues, and I say that with all due respect to my colleagues. But I think, you know, I grew up in Texas under, you know, folks like Bob Bullock, Pete Laney, Bill Hobby. Those were Democrats that believe in the Big Tent party, which means you have liberals, moderates, and conservative Democrats, and that's the way I grew up. And I just believe that Democrats are Democrats, but you do have liberals and you do have moderates and conservative. And I happen to be one of those moderate conservative Democrats on some issues, but on education or certain things, I think I'm very progressive on those issues.
Assess the Democratic Party now. Congressman King was talking about the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. We're going to have...
well, he's not a Democrat.
No, he's actually still an independent.
Yeah, he's independent on that.
But they passed a rule he's going to have to declare himself a Democrat, it seems. We'll see if he does. But yeah, and we're going to have John Delaney on, who is already running for president. And he will probably be one of 27 Democrats, roughly, who run for president. Are you concerned with how the party, the left wing, has become a lot more powerful, where it seems like there are certain litmus tests, whether it's abortion, certainly single payer now has become more of a litmus test, that some centrists in the House that I've talked to are concerned that, centrist Democrats, is that really the pulse of the party has to be a big tent party, a blue dog party, so that's how you build majorities. And if you have all these litmus tests, well, then it's very difficult to get the majority.
Right. Yeah, and you know, I think they were talking about abortion being a litmus test. They were talking about taking no money from fossil fuel companies, and I think they reversed themselves on that. Yep. And this is one of the things I've told my party. I said, guys, you know, the way you grow numbers is you add, you don't subtract. And that's how you win elections, is by adding numbers. You know, I never say anything to a progressive friend of mine. Say, I like the way you vote. I do have some that do that to me, but I always explain to them is, you know, it's a Big Tent party, and that's what we have. But I mean, the Republicans have the same issue. They got their Tea Party folks that are very extreme. Democrats have some folks that are pretty extreme on the left side. And a lot of times that's what the American public hears, the two extremes. And some of us are in the middle, they're trying to work things out, make it hard. It's hard for us because, you know, you hear people all the time say, hey, bipartisan, be bipartisan. And the moment you vote with a Republican or do work on a deal with a Republican, they'll say, what are you doing voting with that Republican? Or what are you doing working with that Republican? And I've heard some of my Republican friends say the same thing is, they'll say, you know, be bipartisan, and they work with a Democrat, and then they get criticized for working with the Democrats. So it's unfortunate, but I think the easy thing is just to go far left or far right. But I think the American public sent us here to get the things done, because this is why I've always, listen, if you are told to just answer one question, that is, you come to Washington and say, what does your party want you to do? Whether it's a Democrat or Republican, then it's easy. You can send anybody to Washington, because all they have to do is ask that one question. What does your party want to do? And I think there's times where my party's right, and there's some times that I disagree with my party. But at the end of the day, I will vote for my district. When I first got elected, you went into the history. There were folks, and I had my labor union guys, I had my environmental guys, all saying, you're not voting your district.
Right.
And they even got to a point where you're Hispanic, and if you're Hispanic, you're in a Hispanic district, so you should be progressive. I mean, literally, the folks were saying that, the national folks, and I just disagree. I mean, I think I know my district pretty well. My hometown, Laredo, I get 90%. I don't think I've gone lower than 89%. I've taken certain votes, and people, as long as you explain to people why you're doing this and what's your rationale, they respect it. They want you to represent their district. I don't think people want you to come up here and represent the party. I mean, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not here representing my Democrat Party. I'm here to represent the people that I represent.
Speaking of your district, I was watching a special last night that focused on Will Hurd in Texas, and he was saying that what D.C. is focused on, the D.C. media too, is not what the constituents around the table. What are the issues that your constituents are talking? Are they talking about Russia? Are they talking about Robert Mueller?
Those are some of the issues. But he's absolutely right. The issues that a lot of the Washington folks, what I call Washingtonize, the issues that we hear a lot. I mean, yes, those are important issues. But, when I go down there, I sit on the appropriations, defense and homeland security. And people, when I go there, is they want to talk about, hey, what are we doing to improve the things at the border? They're not talking about the wall. They're talking about bridges. We got, for example, Laredo handles 15,000 trailers a day. So as a Democrat, trade is very important.
Right.
15,000 trailers. So what do they want to talk about? They're not talking about Border Patrol. They're talking about the men and women in blue, which is CBP officers. Or how do we move traffic a lot faster when you got 15,000 trailers a day? Or another thing, energy. In my area, I got the Eagle Ford, so energy is very important. And I've seen small communities grow, so they're talking about infrastructure. They're talking about healthcare. And my big thing has always been education to me. So I focus a lot on Pell Grants. Today we passed the Health and Human Services, where we increased the Pell Grant up more by $100 on the maximum. Pell Grants are important to me because my father and mother went only to a few years of education. They were migrant workers. In those days, the more hands you had, the more money you had. So they took them out from school to go work in the piscas, which means the fields, the agricultural fields. And my parents were just, they just got a few years of education. So they emphasize education, education, education. And that's one of the things I talk about. When I was in the state legislature, I was the chairman of public and higher ed. Those were the good old days in Texas, where 75% of all the monies went into education. We don't hear much about this, except some of the fights that we have here when it comes to education. So those are the issues that people want to talk about. They want to talk about. So Will is right. I mean, Will is right. A lot of the talking points are used here. I get them and just put them upside down, and I go and talk to and focus on the issues that are important to my district.
And speaking of which, I know that you guys just voted on it, and you mentioned it as a member of the House Appropriations Committee, but there was a big bipartisan vote today to avoid a government shutdown. There will not be a government shutdown.
In D.C., we joke around in our committee that there are Republicans in Congress, there's Democrats, and then there's appropriators. Because we do a lot of things in a bipartisan way. And if it wasn't for the party leaders on both the D's and the R's, we would get a lot of things done. The appropriation gets a lot of things done. In fact, if you look you know, a lot of legislation doesn't pass, but the legislation that has to pass every single time is the appropriation bill. And in the old days, the appropriation used to be how much money do you add, how much money do you subtract. Now, almost every business group or other folks come and talk to us because they want to add language. We're not supposed to legislate in appropriations, but at the end of the day, there is a lot of legislation, especially in December when we do the final bill. And so the appropriation has now become the train that has to move, and therefore it's not only money issues, but there's a lot of policy writers.
Is that the key, that it's must-pass legislation, or it's really an embarrassing thing for both parties? The shutdown is always embarrassing for both parties, whoever wins the battle. Or is it more about relationships on the committee? You know, what's the key to striking deals that, generally speaking, are not struck nowadays?
You know, a lot of it is just relationships. You know, the old days we used to sit down and talk to people. In fact, you know, if you look at it, members are measured a lot of times how many pieces of legislation they file and pass. I have another measure. If you look at what I do in appropriations, I think I pass more than any other member of Congress in appropriations, the writers, because in many ways they're like a piece of legislation. You put language, for example, Health and Human Services, we deal with the unaccompanied kids. Right. Okay? So in there, we added language about don't separate families, making sure you treat the kids with, provide them education, health care, and provide them, once they're in our hands, we got to provide them with the dignity and care that any child deserves. So we add the language there, and a lot of it is just by having those relationships. And when I first got here, I remember talking to my staff as a freshman. I said, hey, we got to get this done and this. Talk to the Democrats and the Republican staff. They looked at me because they worked for another member before I got in, and they said, Republicans? I said, yeah, Republicans on it. I mean, I'm just a big believer that you reach out and get things done. Give you an example. In Texas, the last Democrat that was a Secretary of State was myself, appointed by Rick Perry. Rick Perry, by the way, was a Democrat before he became a Republican. I think he switched in 1989 to run for Ag Commissioner against a very popular Democrat, Jim Hightower. Right. Rick was a Democrat and then a Republican, and his first appointment that he ever made, and his last appointment, I think, as a Democrat was myself in 2001. So those were what I call the good old days of bipartisanship. And
you still have a good relationship with him, right?
Yeah, he just popped into my office the other day.
Oh, really?
So yes, I do.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so the big question heading into the midterms, one of them at least, is the House going to flip to the Democrats? It will flip. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I mean, you never know. I think Peter's right. It's between now and election time, it's a century in political years.
Sure.
A political time. So, but I think all the indicators show that they will flip. What the Republicans have is they did a very good job at redistricting. Where they make the district very Republican. So it's got to be a pretty strong number on that. But as I've said, as the Blue Dogs, what gets a Nancy Pelosi as the next speaker, whoever that might be, it's the Blue Dogs and moderate seats. Because as I told Ms. Pelosi and Steve Israel when Steve was the head of the campaign committee, give me all the seats out there that are liberal seats that the Republicans have. None. So the seats that we have to get the Republicans, you got to have a Democrat that fits that district. And if that member or that candidate is a moderate or conservative, then let that person do what he or she has to do to win that district away from a Republican itself on that. And that's the bottom line. I mean, and this is why I tell my progressive friends, so guys, Pelosi didn't become speaker by winning all these liberal seats. It was, at that time, Blue Dogs, we had 54 Democrats. When we lost the Blue Dogs, we lost the majority, point blank. So, and this is why it's got to be the Big Tent theory. If you're a liberal, that's good. If you're a conservative Democrat, that's good. But you got to work together on that. And what happens is there's a lot of purifying on both sides. The Republicans saying, oh, that person is not Republican enough, run a primary. And, you know, to me, it's happened more than once. My first year I ran against incumbent. The second time they said, oh, how did he win? So they went after me. I mean, they spent millions of dollars against me because they felt that I was a Hispanic, quote, a Hispanic in a Hispanic district, therefore I have to be a progressive to be in this seat. Mm-hmm. That was 14 years ago. And you have this purification effort by both parties that the only way, I mean, I've seen that, oh, we're gonna primary Henry, and we're gonna primary Henry, and we're gonna primary Henry, but again, I think I know my district pretty well.
We're gonna open up for questions. I do want to ask you though, the magic number for Democrats to win back the House is 23. We've written that the magic number for Nancy Pelosi to be Speaker is probably closer to 35 because there are some candidates and some members who said, I'm not going to vote for her. Right. Do you think, and while she may not have the votes now or maybe right after the election, there really is no one close to how many votes she has. There's not a close second. So do you think when the dust settles, if Democrats win, that she'll end up being the Speaker?
I've learned one thing about Nancy. You know, her politics is very different from mine. Mm-hmm. But I've learned that that she can work with blue dogs, mm-hmm. and I've seen that because I've sat down with her in many meetings on that, and I see her the way she interacts. I would not put my money against Nancy Pelosi. I mean, she's good. She really is.
She knows how to count votes.
She knows how to count votes. I would not put my money against her, and certainly, you know, I'm a blue dog. I'm in her leadership, and I've been part of her leadership for years. And part of it is I've gone to know her. And mm-hmm. again, first thing first win. Then we can worry
see
about
what happens.
Then
right.
we can talk about that later.
Yeah. Okay. We'll open up for questions.
Hey, hold it. Peter King didn't have that many questions. Hey, by the way, I'm not here to fact check Peter King. I mean, I'm just kidding. I told him I was here to fact check. He is a good member, and I enjoyed working with Peter King. He's a good man. I'll let y'all decide.
We talked a lot about voting, and yesterday was absentee voting registration at AU. So with this new generation of millennials going to vote and all these mass movements of voting of young voters, do you see the future of politics going more like the millennial generation being more open to bipartisanship, or do you think we're going to be more polarizing of the political?
You know, that depends on the young folks on it. And, you know, I got two daughters, 20 and about to 21, and one that just turned 25. And Saturday, I was in Laredo, and I had just talked to the law enforcement, the state convention of law enforcement there. And then my daughter in the afternoon says, Dad, I need for you to drop me off at Beto O'Rourke's campaign because I want to be there. And I said, well, if I'm taking you, then I'm showing up. And I ended up introducing Beto O'Rourke. He's a friend of mine. And the energy there, I mean, there were different folks there, but the energy from the young folks are just amazing. As an example, y'all can play a role. I went into a Starbucks 2 Saturdays ago, Saturday and Sunday. And so I show up and lined up there were laptops. And they had low earsets, and it was young people calling on behalf of Beto O'Rourke. They were what they call pop-up offices, campaign offices. You know, we're used to renting an office and doing all this, and it was just this new, innovative, and it was the young folks. So the future depends on you all. And I always encourage people, get involved. You know, when I ran, I was a young one, and they said, hey, you're too young to run for state rep and then congressman. And but I always encourage the young people, go vote, but get involved in races, and be the candidate also.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
1 minute and 6 seconds.
Hello, Congressman. So, given that you may likely find yourself in the majority leadership after November or for the next Congress, will you publicly push for more bipartisanship in an effort to kind of get rid of some of the deadlock or the gridlock in the House?
Yeah, I have, and I will, and I'll tell you this, a couple of things. One is we can't look at the past and say, the Republicans did this, so we're going to do the same thing to the Republicans. There's that knee reaction. That's one thing. And then the other thing, I pushed for a lot of bipartisan. I think people, you know, when I first came in, they try to define you. And I told myself back in 2005, I said, either I define myself or they're going to define you. And the moment they define you, they expect you to be in that same perception, that little box that I said. And that's why I decided to define. I can give you a lot of stories. I know we're out of time, but people know that I'm very bipartisan. They know this. They know I'm a blue dog. And they know my response, pay your dues, then come and talk to me if you have a complaint. But it's one of those things that I think bipartisanship has to happen, and it's hard, but I will continue pushing for that. Otherwise, you know, we're all in the same field, and that field is, you know, we're all frustrated.
We're out of time. Please thank the Congressman for joining us. I hand it back to Jack.
Thank you.